Hey everyone, good evening. What's collaborative law? How is it different than mediation? Is it legally binding? Can you divorce amicably or settle a custody case in a positive manner? We're going to find out that and much, much more tonight. So in today's Get Off the Couch segment, I'm going to encourage you to tell your story. My friend Vince Gaglione wrote a book called The Narratives. And in this book, which is available 99 cents on Amazon, right price, and we'll put up a link for it, he tells of his healing journey. He's just an average guy who decided to write about his life. And he chose to write about his life, but you might want to tell it through dance, through a sculpture, or some kind of other art. But we all have a story to tell. And I believe when we tell our story, it helps us to get to know ourselves better, but it also allows us to heal. Because so many times, people feel our stories from the past define us and get us stuck. So figure out some way to tell your story. And the other thing I'm going to encourage, if someone comes to you for their story, be positive, be helpful. When I first wrote about my healing journey, it was really raw, and I sent it to a book editor who had the kindness in her heart to say, hey, you know what? It needs some more work. It's just not quite ready. And the truth of the matter was it sucked, but she was kind enough to not say that. So be gentle with someone. If they're trusting you enough to share something so vulnerable, be kind. All right, we're going to tell you about tonight's guest. Tom Burns works with clients to resolve their legal issues and believes it's a best practice to resolve disputes respectfully and stays at the forefront of the collaborative practice movement. Tom has been trained in mediation and collaborative law and applies these techniques when appropriate. He's the vice president for the board of directors for the Howard County Collaborative Professionals and treasurer for the Maryland Collaborative Practice Council. Tom was born and raised in Philadelphia. He received his degree from St. Joseph's University and his JD from the University of Baltimore School of Law. He began his career as a law clerk to the Honorable Susan Merzetta, General Master of the Circuit for Baltimore City. He worked for Legal Aid and the Baltimore City Department of Social Services. Tom handled numerous child abuse and neglect cases, representing both children and later Baltimore City. This cultivated an interest in working with families who are seeking resolution for their legal and practical issues. Today, he enjoys working on a broad range of practice areas at Berger & Burns, LLC, the firm he co-founded in 2009 with his partner and friend, Victor Berger. Tom, his wife, and daughter reside in Baltimore. Tom is an avid sports fan. He enjoys attending sports events and playing softball among his many pursuits. Welcome, Tom.
Hi, Julie. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm a big fan of the show, and I'm very excited to share this alternative approach to resolving conflict with your audience. I'm as excited about that as I am about the Ravens making the Super Bowl, and as I live in Baltimore, that is really saying something, and I'm wearing my purple tie.
Okay, well, we'll just address this and get it out in the open in the beginning. For my longtime viewers, you'll know I'm a huge Steelers fan, but you know what? This is a great learning moment, because if a rabid Steelers fan and an even crazier Ravens fan can be friends, although he is my only Ravens friend, then there's hope for the world and that you can divorce amicably and settle your other issues that way. So we're going to learn about that tonight. So, Tom, let's get started. What exactly is collaborative law?
As we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of it later, Julie, I'll give you my elevator speech. In short, collaborative practice is an alternative to the traditional combative litigation process that focuses on helping the parties move beyond their conflict more productively and less painfully. I think there are three significant points to highlight about collaborative practice. First, it engages people outside of the courtroom in an open, supportive, lower conflict process to find shared solutions. The parties and their lawyers enter into a participation agreement wherein the lawyers will be disqualified if the matter doesn't resolve amicably and requires a court resolution. And this makes the process more open and less adversarial. Second, it is a team-based approach in which each party has a collaboratively trained lawyer in the room and the option to call on neutrals or other counselors for additional support, keeping talks productive and supportive. And finally, it's a transparent process based upon good faith, wherein the parties share relevant information in an effort to brainstorm all of their options and to reach acceptable solutions.
Have you always practiced collaborative law, or was there something that happened in your life that you said, hey, you know what, I want to learn if there's an alternative so it doesn't have to be combative?
Yeah, for me, collaborative practice is a personal and professional growth issue. collaborative practice is a relatively new concept. It was founded initially by the so-called godfather of collaborative law, Stu Webb, who was an attorney, family law attorney in Minnesota, who watched the impact and negative impact of the court system on families, and ultimately decided that there had to be a better way to do things. When I went to law school in the early 1990s, graduating in 1995 and practicing since that time, I'd never heard of collaborative law. I think most people didn't. It was new. It was evolving. At that point, mediation was beginning to take hold. There were some skeptics about that at the time, but the landscape has changed dramatically. For me, as a young attorney, ultimately I ended up going through a divorce myself, and that led me away from my earlier practice areas and doing child abuse and neglect cases for the state and some other estate practice, which I still do, but I focused more on family law. And then in practicing in that area, ultimately I had my mentor who discovered collaborative law ahead of me, and he talked to me a great deal about it. And it really just fit in with kind of my personal and practice philosophy.
Well, I didn't know about collaborative law until I met you, and I come from an attorney of families, and I consider myself pretty up on what's going on just in general. And what excites me about this is because, we were joking earlier when I was watching football with spiritual friends. They're like, oh my gosh, how can you be so spiritual and zen, and then you turn into a crazy lady watching football? It's the same. You think at one point you walk down the aisle with this person, you said, hey, I want to love you and spend the rest of my life with you, and then all that's out the window. It can be very bitter and just awful. And while you're here, I have a question for you, because I've seen this a lot. I'm pretty active on Twitter and don't notice it as much, but I'm amazed at the amount of what I see people post on Facebook. To me, I think, I was telling you before the show started, I had a friend who posted all these horrible things about her ex-husband, and I'm like, you know what? This is really awful. Your kids are going to read this. You need to just take a step back. And, of course, she didn't listen to me. So, one, I'd like your thoughts, not only as an attorney, but from a collaborative law. What do you say to people who are taking their case, so to speak, to social media?
It's not a good idea. Again, in terms of acting respectfully in life in general, even beyond a divorce process, you have to be very careful about what you post on Facebook. And anytime that you're involved in a legal battle, altercation, so to speak, you need to be especially careful. The law is still developing around Facebook, so in terms of the admissibility of certain posts and things of that nature, it can vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But even beyond the legal piece, there are families that are involved, and there are things that are out there, and once they're said, it's hard to take them back. Even if you pull it off and you delete the comment, there are people who've seen it, and it's out in the universe.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Wes Welker's wife,
Yes.
She got in trouble for that. So be careful when you're on social media. Now, I want to remind everyone, if you have a question for Tom, you can chat it, and I'm happy to ask him, or call in at 919-518-9773, or you can Skype in at Computers 2K Voice. Now, Tom, can you explain what the difference between collaborative law and mediation is?
Sure. I'm trained myself both as a mediator and a collaborative practitioner, as you mentioned. And most collaborative practitioners are trained in mediation. It's typically a requirement that will occur afterwards because a lot of those skills are what's used during the collaborative process. So I'm a fan of both processes. And, conflict resolution is a tough business. Yeah. And different models will work for different people. So, I'll promote any and all models, anything that will resolve conflict in a positive way given a factual situation. In terms of mediation, in the mediation process, when I'm wearing that hat, I would be acting as a neutral. I'd sit down with the couple. I give them a safe place to have a conversation. I help them to hear each other, but I don't necessarily give them or provide them legal advice or volunteer some things. I'm really helping them to have the conversation and helping them reach a resolution of the conflict as they see it. In the collaborative law process, what happens is it evolves through a series of meetings. Lawyers are always involved in the dialogue, so there's advice that's going on throughout that process, and in that sense, it's a more supportive process. Beyond that, in the collaborative process, you can also involve other professionals, including mental health professionals that would act as coaches to provide communication help between the parties. You could have one coach or multiple coaches. You can have financial experts that are involved that the parties would jointly employ to share information. And you can also have, when there are children involved, a child specialist who would, meet with the children and typically provide a voice for the children.
And so all those different, the mental health professionals, financial advisors, so that's part of what you would call the interdisciplinary team that would be involved in this process.
That's correct. And again, that's part of what really makes the collaborative process unique. It lends support, and it comes at the crisis, so to speak, that conflict, in a more holistic and hopefully a healing and transformative way when it works really well.
But in the collaborative practice, say if there was a divorce, the husband would have an attorney and the wife would have an attorney, but perhaps then would you only have one financial person or one mental health? They wouldn't each need their own person, because would they kind of serve as a mediator? Like you were talking earlier, if a couple comes in and have your mediator hat on, then you can talk to them and hear both sides. But in something lawyer, they would each need someone to represent them. But would they each need a mental health person, or are they the neutral party that comes in and says, hey, okay, we've evaluated both sides and here's our findings?
Now, that can depend on the circumstances.
Okay.
Specifically with the mental health professionals, cost sometimes becomes an issue in these things too. I've worked in one coach models where there's a coach to help provide, guidance to both people. Again, not necessarily, though that oftentimes are trained as therapists, they're not providing couples therapy, they're not providing personal therapy. What they're really doing, in effect, is helping that couple to communicate and helping to be respectful of the emotional element of the conflict and, providing some guidance in that regard. So in some instances, we've recommended that there be two coaches so that each person can kind of have their own person to work with. Other times it's worked with one coach. And beyond that, with regard to financial professionals and child specialists, typically in that instance, it would be one person that the parties would jointly choose, jointly pay for. And, in an adversarial process, you might have two people, two financial professionals that you're paying, giving different advice. Here, because you're both on the same page, hiring this person, you use that advice and you apply that, to your situation more efficiently.
Okay, so can you take us through what the collaborative process would look like? So a client comes to your office, they're like, Tom, I need to hire you, I need to get a divorce. How does that look? How does that process begin?
When folks come into my office initially, it's a very trying and difficult time typically, and we talk about, the situation. Oftentimes they're talking about why it didn't work, whether or not it's something that they feel is, irreparable, or whether it's something they want to work on in the relationship. And then after that, I think that attorneys have, in my opinion, and in some states this has been statutorily required, but there's an ethical obligation, I believe, to make people aware of all their options to resolve the dispute, including collaborative law. That can include mediation, negotiation, the traditional adversarial litigation process, folks talking it out among themselves. So that's how it typically begins, is making them aware of that process. Even then, as you noted, a lot of people have not heard of it. Even though it's spread leaps and bounds since 1990, it's now worldwide, and there are collaborative practitioners in every state in the country. My state, Maryland, here in North Carolina, I typically will share a book that was authored by Stu Webb and another colleague of his, Ron Oski, and it's called The Collaborative Way to Divorce. And a lot of times people will give a lot of thought as to the process that they're going to choose, because it really sets the tone for the dialogue and where it will go. And to me, that's an important part of it. And I'll encourage them to share it with their spouse, because both parties have to be on board in any alternative dispute resolution model, whether it's collaborative or mediation or otherwise, for it to really work.
Absolutely. Now, I want to remind everyone, if you have a question for Tom, chat it in, or you can call in at 919-518-9773 or Skype computers 2K voice. So my understanding is that collaborative law can be used in civil and family cases. So we've talked about divorce. Can you talk about other cases where it's been successful or that you can use it?
Yeah, again, it's expanded quite a bit geographically and then in terms of content, as you're noting. In the family law area, we've mentioned divorce and custody and modification. It could work. Because when you have a divorce case, particularly when it involves children, the child piece never necessarily is going to go away until the children are older. Right. There are changes in circumstances that need to be reevaluated, whether it's child support, whether it's access or decision-making. So those things can go on. It also in family law cases has become more common with same-sex couples who might have property issues to divide, things of that nature. There are estate disputes and other family-type disputes, sometimes involving elderly parents as an example, where families might argue over what might be best for a particular parent, and there's a lot of sibling rivalry and things that go on. And in this instance, it gives folks an opportunity to work through that in a more respectful way. And then there's civil beyond the family. And in terms of the civil practice, you might see it in things like employment discrimination. Typically, any scenario where there's a relationship that might, between the parties that might need to be salvaged, business disputes, whether it's a family business or whether it's a partnership among friends or colleagues, longtime people dividing property. It can be helpful in that situation. Medical malpractice cases have also become kind of a new area or a continued expanded area, kind of a natural fit for collaborative law. The court system can really only offer financial solutions, and a lot of times there's a lot more to it than the financial element for people. And it's in North Carolina in particular, there's a program here called the IACT program that's in the Triangle area, IACT. It's integrated accessibility and collaborative transparency, and it brings together providers and families that have and patients that have suffered medical malpractice issues, and it enables them to work on things, even if it's something. The money element can still be a part of it, of course, but there can be apology, which can be so powerful. And beyond that, in the traditional litigation process, you oftentimes will end up with a scenario wherein the doctors are being protected by insurance companies and attorneys, and there's not really a scenario to discuss, hey, what really went wrong, and how can we fix that in a new way? And in that sense, collaborative law can be a game changer, to make hospitals better and safer.
I read something not too long about medical malpractice, and it was just what you were talking about. The family, it wasn't about the money. What they really wanted was an apology and an explanation of what happened. And the doctor was advised by his insurance and by his legal team. And so perhaps if they had done the collaborative practice, then it could have saved a lot of heartache for everyone. And so those are really great examples. Now, I'm going to assume that, although I have watched a lot of Law and Order, I am not an attorney, this can't be used in criminal cases.
No, typically it wouldn't work there. You'd have your traditional system. There's the constitutional rights that criminal defendants would have. There are plea bargains that take place, so there's kind of some informal negotiation, but collaborative law wouldn't be a fit in the criminal area.
Even say if there were juveniles that had done things, perhaps that were criminal, could that potentially in the future, do you think, saying, okay, this kid's really young, they did something wrong, even though it's criminal, but maybe say if they damaged property, at someone, could you bring them in? Or if they threw tomatoes at a congressman and the congressman was really upset, could they come in and say, okay, you know what, I know that you could go to jail for being a terrorist or whatever, but could there be a discussion there? Do you think there's potential for that?
I think that happens to some degree already.
Okay.
In my another life, I was an attorney for the Baltimore City Department of Social Services. My wife's actually a master in the juvenile court system. It's funny that you say that, in Baltimore City. So she hears abuse and neglect cases, but also juvenile delinquency cases. And one of the things that I think attracted me to collaborative law was being in that practice early on. There was an emphasis on trying to do right by these children when things would work well. Recognition that there needed to be some punishment, but also an opportunity for redemption and second chances. So in that system, there typically are social workers that are involved, parole and probation type people, juvenile services type people that would work to try to come up with an outcome that would make some sense.
Okay.
And oftentimes it works well, though, of course, we know the system is imperfect.
Right, absolutely. Now, we've got a question here for you, Tom, from Babylicious. Great question. Can you go through collaborative law and end up in court anyway?
Yes, and in effect, what happens is when you start the collaborative process, you would begin by way of a participation agreement whereby the attorneys and the parties execute a document that says that they're not going to go to court. They're going to work on the solution. Again, that helps it to be an open and less adversarial process, but collaborative, like any alternative dispute resolution model, is not perfect. There are times when it might not work, and if it doesn't work, the parties could pull the plug, or at least one of the parties could, if that happens, or both, pull the plug on it, and then they could go back and return to the more traditional litigation process if they needed a court-based resolution.
Now, we talked a little bit, I know when I was first asking you to be on the show, and you said at times, that the collaborative law process can be as expensive as if you're just doing the regular court scenario. But what I'm thinking, it would probably be a lawyer's fees are more than, say, the mental health professional, maybe not the financial advisor. And if you're, spending all those hours, I would think in most cases you have a better shot of saving money and spending less money because you're, spending time trying to work together as opposed to, what was that, the War of the Roses film, just take them down completely. So What are your thoughts on the financial cost of collaborative law versus traditional law?
One of the frustrating things, I think, to individuals and families that are going through this is the financial element to it. No question about it. You're talking about a scenario in any of the models where you typically have two incomes very often supporting a situation, and now supporting one family home, and now you're moving toward two family homes. So it becomes a time where finances become especially important and relevant. With that being said, traditional litigation can be expensive. Collaborative law can be expensive. Every case is kind of unique. It's frustrating for me as a practitioner, I think, and for individuals when they come in, because it's sometimes very difficult to give them an overview as to what it might cost, because it can really depend on the emotions involved in the situation, the legal issues, the complications that are involved. So every situation's a little different. To me, in that regard, collaborative is not necessarily different than litigation. And to your earlier point, I'm not necessarily a therapist or a financial professional, though by the nature of what I do, I know a lot about those things, and sometimes I feel like a therapist and a financial professional. Typically, in at least where I am, my hourly rate, an attorney's hourly rate, is typically going to be higher than that of a therapist or other financial professionals, and you are paying the attorney more per hour to give advice on something that they're not necessarily specifically trained for. So you can, at least in theory, get more bang for your buck in the collaborative process in that regard.
Outstanding. And we've got a question from Typhonia here. Are doctors willingly doing this? Do you have any thoughts on that? Maybe just in general. I know it can't be case specific.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that it is evolving. Again, speaking kind of very generally here, and more of what I've heard with doctors that I know and things of that nature. The insurance companies, still may not necessarily be big fans of this. There's some evolution to it. Doctors, I think, are oftentimes more willing than the insurance companies. Yeah. So it's still something that's evolving. In North Carolina, there's this particular program, and there's kind of an opt-in. There's an entry. You go to the website, actually. It's iact.com, and you could learn some more about that specifically. So it's still evolving.
Excellent. Okay, well, if you have a question for Tom, feel free to chat it, and I'll ask it. Or you can call in at 919-518-9773 or Skype in at Computers 2K Voice. Now, Tom, you've given us a good overview of the collaborative law practice. So Can you maybe give finer points of what's the difference between, say, someone comes in for a divorce or custody or an elderly issue? How would it be different if they were going to go the more traditional legal route as opposed to the collaborative route?
Yeah, law schools, that's the way they train lawyers, though that is evolving. When I mentioned back when I was in law school, there were no collaborative law type classes. I can tell you that in Maryland at the University of Baltimore and University of Maryland, those concepts and classes are being developed, which is encouraging to those of us in collaborative practice. With that being said, there are times that people need a court-based resolution, situations where collaborative or mediation might not work. Sometimes domestic violence situations, things where there are imbalances of power, and other times where people simply need their day in court. So what happens in those cases typically is, you would file, or I would file on behalf of the client, a pleading with the court system that would start that bureaucratic court process rolling. The other side would be served with a complaint. They'd have an opportunity to respond. One of the things that makes it I can say difficult for me to do it because I still have a fairly significant litigation practice. But one of the things that I've noted, and when I'm kind of counseling people about being respectful, is a lot of times in these pleadings what comes out is it's an all or nothing type situation where you're indicating, that there's got to be grounds for divorce that have to be pled. You have to ask for the sun, the moon, and the stars oftentimes, because if you don't ask for those things, then there's no opportunity to get them, and it can create or kind of fan the flames of conflict in that regard, which is why it can be troublesome for families. Again, with that being said, there are situations where there are cases that just require a court-based resolution.
And I would wonder, is it possible, just because, you're in Baltimore, which is a city, Raleigh, which is really big. I grew up in a fairly small city, small town, but I would think the legal process would also take more time with the filing and this and that, whereas at collaborative law, if you can kind of just sit down and start hashing things out, you don't have to worry about the court calendar. Yeah,
I mean, contrasting that, there are pros and cons to each approach, like with anything in life. But in Maryland, speaking in that system, it would typically take about a year to get through that system. And there'd be multiple court appearances. There wouldn't necessarily be an opportunity to have control over the dates and times. There's a public element versus a privacy element. In the collaborative process, you could start, relatively quickly. Though when you have large teams, it can be a challenge to schedule things to involve everyone. But there's more control over the timing of the outcome, and that is often, and the privacy element, and that's often very attractive to people.
We've got another question for you here on chat, Tom. Dancer wants to know, is there an association I can reference for a hookup in my state?
Yes. I'm a member of, and most collaborative practitioners are a member of, what's now called the International Academy of Collaborative Professionals, the IACP. And they would have, and most collaborative practitioners are members. There are practice groups in many counties and many states that people would be members of. A lot of times they're required to be members of the International Academy. And the website there is actually collaborativepractice.com. And in that instance, you could click on where you live, and it would list collaborative professionals, including attorneys, financial professionals, mental health professionals that would be able to help.
Now, would you say now 50% of your practice is collaborative law, or if you had to estimate?
It's still evolving. I mean, for me, I still do some estate practice and estate planning. So of my family law practice, I'd say probably about 2/3 of what I'm doing is alternative dispute resolution type stuff, whether it's mediating directly or providing legal counsel to folks who are in a mediation process, or the collaborative practice itself. I'd say probably, again, it's still kind of growing. So in my particular instance, I'd probably say maybe about 20%.
And so when you have a client come in, do you say, hey, just FYI, if you didn't know, I do collaborative law and it might be something you want to explore? Do you let clients know that?
Yeah, I've had some people seek me out specifically because I'm a collaborative practitioner, and even if I'm not necessarily handling the case in a collaborative fashion, they might come to me because they like the idea of that in terms of a practice and other models. So as I'd indicated earlier, I think what I do is I make them aware of what all of their options are. I try to be very respectful of what I typically would call, the feet on the ground, so to speak. I need their feedback as to what they would think would work.
Right.
It's not necessarily about me selling the collaborative
Right.
process or mediation or litigation. The way I would look at it, it's my duty and my job to educate them about what their options are, and then together we kind of make that decision with me trying to be respectful of what they think might work.
Now, there are obviously lawyers, and you mentioned mental health professionals, but like at the IACP, what other professionals practice collaboratively?
Beyond the mental health professionals, I think you'd be looking at the financial professionals,
Okay.
and we've kind of talked about that generally. But more specifically, in our county, in Howard County, we have accountants that we might work with that would provide tax advice, because oftentimes in these situations, whether it's alimony or payments being made on a mortgage, or otherwise, child deductions, there are tax implications to these deals. So we work with accountants that are collaboratively trained. Beyond that, we've worked with mortgage professionals. We have mortgage professionals that are collaboratively trained in our county. Real estate professionals that might help people, look at properties or give them options as to what they can do with their property, whether it's a refinance or a sale, things of that nature.
Oh, that's fantastic. So really, whatever comes up in the legal issue, you will be able to have a practitioner that can help.
Right, and it's helpful as an attorney. As I said, it takes some of the pressure off of us, not that people are warm and fuzzy about attorneys typically, but it is nice to have other professionals as part of a team that we can rely on, where there are multiple people trying to help folks to resolve their conflicts and give them good options. We've
got another question for you here on chat from Huckleberry. He said, I didn't get all of this. Does each side have an attorney or only one attorney total? It's still in the collaborative law practice. Each side would have an attorney.
There would still be two attorneys. From an attorney client's perspective, there are ethical considerations that would go into this. So attorneys are not able to represent both parties. In the collaborative process, typically it would evolve through a series of meetings where both parties and both attorneys would always be present, which doesn't necessarily happen in the litigation process. Sometimes it would at a settlement conference and things of that nature. Sometimes in mediation, attorneys can be present, in those models. But one attorney could not represent both clients, but oftentimes all the parties would be in the room and both attorneys.
Okay, and we have another question here from Cynthia. I'm a realtor. How can I get involved?
Always looking for people, Cynthia, who are interested in collaborative practice and collaborative professionals. Speaking, from a professional standpoint, in my instance, it's been very good, networking experience. I've come to meet a lot of like-minded professionals, and there are plenty of trainings. I know when I was training in 2006, trainings were kind of few and far between at that point. I knew people who were training a year or two before. My mentor, at the time, had to travel a fair amount. I knew people who traveled to different states to get trained. Nowadays, if you do a Google search and look for collaborative law training, you could probably find some training in your area. There are a lot of training companies that would provide mediation training, collaborative law training, and typically for a professional, you're looking at a minimum of a 2-day training to meet the initial requirements to realistically practice collaboratively.
And so then, are you certified as an attorney to practice collaborative law? And so, for instance, would there be different training for Cynthia because she's a realtor and she's kind of on the peripheral, where you're the attorney and actually at the meat of the case? So what's the proper term? Are you certified? If someone's like, hey, I want to find an attorney that does this, what do they need to look for?
Yeah, there's not necessarily a certification process in and of itself. In terms of our practice group and the International Academy, the two-day training would be required, and this would typically be something that all professionals would attend, because we would all be learning about collaborative principles and the way that it would work.
Okay.
Oftentimes, attorneys are kind of the gatekeeper in these cases, because a lot of folks in family law cases will come to the attorneys, and the attorneys can kind of start the ball rolling in terms of the collaborative team. but there's not necessarily a specific certification beyond this training. And I know best practice, speaking for myself here in my group, it'd be difficult to work with someone who didn't have the training. We might be able to work on a case in a different model or work, I'll call it collaborative little c, so to speak. But the formal collaborative process, typically for me, I wouldn't necessarily be comfortable unless I was working with someone who was of like mind and had similar training.
Now we've got a question from jury thing. Well, kind of off collaborative law here, but what do you think about having a professional jury pool?
A professional jury pool, that's interesting. With regard to a professional jury pool, I think that is probably, my personal opinion, something that would probably be fairly tricky to pull off. The citizen jury pool is something that's gone on for a long time. And in terms of, this litigation process with things like collaborative law and mediation a while back, these are kind of new ways of trying to solve long time and existing problems. And these systems aren't necessarily always responsive to change.
Right. Well, I once made it to the box in Los Angeles in front of Judge Ito, and I was kicked off by the prosecutor because it was a murder case. And I said, well, if someone attacks me, I'm going to fight for my life, and I'm the one getting up. And the prosecutor said, you're gone. So anyway, although, I think it's a good thing to have, should be part of your being a citizen of this country to serve on a jury. I think that's really important to understand the process, and hopefully if you do collaborative law, then a jury's a moot point for any of this. But that brings up another question. So we talked earlier about the difference between mediation. So collaborative law is still legal and binding. It's not some kind of alternative thing, and then it's going to change later. You're still signing paperwork. The divorce would still be entered into whatever it is or contract. So it's still, I just want to make clear to everyone, correct, that it's still legally binding.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, in any form of alternative dispute resolution, collaborative law included, mediation, negotiation, in things of that nature, the ultimate goal is to get to a marital settlement agreement that would resolve ideally all of the issues among the parties, to include the child-related issues, the property-related issues, and you would end up with a binding contract that would hold up in court. Typically, at that point in the collaborative process, like in any of these processes, there would be pleadings that would be filed with the court ultimately, though those would typically be uncontested pleadings simply to get the divorce. Again, the contract, that marital settlement agreement, would become then incorporated in that judgment of divorce, and would be, beyond being a contract, would be an order of court that, if it's violated, would carry the penalty of contempt.
Now, Tom, can you, because again, you've gone through divorce, you kind of have a personal perspective on this. Why I wanted to have you on the show is because of this whole show is about body, mind, and spirit. But talk about it either personally or professionally, what people gain from doing collaborative law, whether it's less stress, I think a sense of closure. Can you maybe think about some cases you've had where you can talk about benefits that people receive?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is something that's really personal to me, having gone through it personally and worked with so many people, from a professional standpoint. I can think of cases that I've had where, I had one client come to me at one point who'd gone through the litigation process and, in effect, went back to the relationship and, half-kiddingly, I suppose, said it was like couples therapy, because it was so painful to go through the process that, people stay in relationships sometimes that aren't necessarily healthy or productive to them. So when there are alternatives out there that might enable people to manage conflict in a better way, it's something that enables them to move forward in their lives in a better way. And collaborative, when it works really well, can be transformative. Again, from a personal standpoint, when I was going through my divorce, I had not even heard of collaborative law. And even as an insider in the system, I found it particularly painful and frustrating. It's part of why I ended up going to do family practice later. My experience tells me as a professional that when people resolve conflicts and reach resolutions jointly, that what happens is that the results are longer lasting, and that means less future conflict. And it also means that as conflict's kind of inevitable in life sometimes, and in situations where there are children, situations change and things need to be reviewed, as we'd mentioned before, whether it's child support or, decisions about where a child might go to school, or religious decisions, or even access decisions with people moving. People tend to go back to that same model that worked for them. So if they go into a litigated model that's kind of highly conflictual, and combative, then when the next issue comes up, they tend to go back into that cycle, which can be, psychically kind of damaging for individuals, for families, for the children that are involved. And again, if they have resolved it through mediation or through collaborative law or otherwise, they tend to go back to those models and, feel more comfortable resolving their conflict.
I think as human beings, we all just want to be heard. I mean, I think I've never been through a divorce. I dated someone on and off a really long time, way too long. But, for me, it wasn't as painful as a divorce, but it was still painful. And what I realized, and, we're in a great space. He's a friend. But kind of over about 18 months, I got some questions answered. And I was able to say, you made me feel this. One thing I learned when I worked at USC is how to have a discussion or how to have an argument. Instead of saying, USOB, you say, like, I feel hurt because you did this, and to open up the communication process. So I think that if people, like, I'm thinking about the friend that I had on Facebook, and she was so angry and bitter, if perhaps she had the chance to say, you know what, you really hurt me. We were married and you had an affair, then that would help heal it, as opposed to, and I think from a woman's perspective, and don't shoot me, all the feminists out there, was women, we tend to be a little more emotional than men, and if you're not highly evolved and able to take that step back and you're caught up in the emotion, then if you're hurt, then you're going to lash out. So if you have that opportunity to just air out your feelings, I think it makes it much better for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, not as a mental health professional, but just from what I've seen anecdotally, I think it can be extremely helpful, the power of apology. And it's one of those things that in an alternative dispute resolution process and something like collaborative law, where you sign an agreement that says that you're not going to go to court, you can talk about these things head on. Whereas in the litigation process, you might have an allegation and a pleading, like we'd mentioned earlier on, if you start that way, that might allege adultery, and it kind of fans those emotional flames. The other side denies it, which sometimes people know that it's going on, and that makes it even more difficult to talk about kind of the other issues, kind of the not to minimize the adultery, but to deal with the other issues that come out of it, because everyone is so focused on that. Whereas in a process like collaborative, with coaches and mental health professionals there to provide emotional guidance and communication guidance, I've had cases where people have made admissions about these things, and it has cleared the air and enabled both parties to move forward and talk about the issues resulting from the breakup of the relationship, rather than being so focused on those hurt feelings as a result of what had happened.
Got a great comment here from Alpha. Great explanation of the lasting benefits of the collaborative process. Less future conflict. I'll remind you, if you have a question for Tom, chat it, or you can call in at 919-518-9773 or Skype Computers 2K Voice. So you mentioned earlier, which I love, the man, they started out, they're going to get a divorce, and then, the relationship ended up being repaired. Can you give another example, perhaps, of someone that started in the traditional legal route and came to use the collaborative process?
Sure. People change attorneys sometimes in cases for whatever reason, whether it's stylistic, they don't feel like they're on the same page with their attorneys. They feel like they've spent a lot of money sometimes and haven't really gotten anywhere or achieved a significant level of progress in their opinion. So they'll come sometimes for second opinions, third opinions. They'll talk to friends, family, other counsel. So I've had, people who have, in effect, said that process wasn't working for them and that they were looking for some alternative. There are some attorneys, who are maybe skeptics of collaborative, who might not be nearly as big an advocate as I might be of that particular process. And sometimes, people might draw a conclusion that they want to move in a different direction. And that could go from collaborative to litigation as well, as we mentioned. I've had folks who've come and said, hey, this isn't working. I want to try something different. They then try the collaborative process, and, the hope is that it works for them. I've had cases like that where that's happened. In Maryland, systemically, the court system in Maryland has been very supportive of the collaborative movement. And in our model, we're required typically to wrap up a case within a year from the time it's filed to the time it's concluded. And courts are, again, bureaucratic in nature, pretty protective of trying to meet those timelines. Though in our state, and in particular in our county, in Howard County, the courts have allowed cases to be stayed to enable kind of an end, not an end, but bring a halt to the litigation proceedings to enable parties to work it out through the collaborative process.
Now, Tigger has a question for you. And I believe you did say earlier that collaborative law is practiced worldwide because they want to know if it's available in other countries.
It is. Canada in particular comes to mind. Canada was a very early adopter. I think one of my earliest trainings was by a Canadian collaborative professional. So it's been adopted there, fairly. There's some towns. There's a town in Canada in particular when I was being trained that I heard that almost all the divorces there were done collaboratively. So very, different from the way that we would practice here in general. But it's spread worldwide. If you go to that IACP site, you'd look at it, you would see that it is in most countries, around the world.
Now, Dancer wants to know, and we kind of touched on this earlier, you mentioned the godfather of collaborative law, but what was the start of this? What was the impetus? So did the godfather, I'm sorry, I don't remember his name,
Stu Webb.
Stu Webb. Did Stu go through something that made him, or was just his observation of being a practicing attorney? Yeah,
I don't know Stu personally. People in the collaborative movement, know of him a great deal, and he's very active. At there's an annual conference and things of that nature, and he's very involved in the practice. It's his baby, so to speak, in that regard. But my understanding of it is that, again, it's from the nature of being a professional and practicing in this area, routinely, and just seeing the impact of the system on families and children that eventually kind of wears at the practitioners psychically. And it was something that became too much to bear, I suppose, for him. And that's why ultimately he decided to look at this another way. And, of course, many practitioners that I know are of like mind.
Now, Tom, if someone out there is perhaps having an issue with custody case or divorce or elderly parents, what are some questions that they can ask themselves to consider whether or not collaborative law would be a good fit for them?
A lot of websites that you would find and books that you would read would give you, questions of that nature. I think the Stu Webb book that I mentioned earlier and the Ron Oski book would provide those. Typically, I think that what you need to look at, in terms of some questions that I could think of would be, is the tone of the dialogue with your spouse a respectful one? Do you want to prioritize the needs of your children? Do the needs of you and your spouse both merit consideration? Do you believe in working creatively and cooperatively to reach resolutions and solve problems? And, can you act ethically toward your spouse? Some people, can't answer yes to these questions. And if you can answer yes to these type of questions, it's something that you probably should get educated about and at least explore.
Okay, now we've got another question for Huckleberry. Now we're going to remind you, if you have a question for Tom, chat it in, 919-518-9773 or Skype Computers 2K Voice. Huckleberry asks, how would I propose this for medical malpractice to my doctor or his insurance company?
That's trickier in terms of, you could have a dialogue with your doctor about the process and ask them whether they're involved in such a program. Again, this is still, I think, an area that is still growing and evolving. So you could ask your doctor about the nature of this. Most doctors, I'm sure, are still probably involved in that traditional system. But, the feedback to the doctors would be important because it would, again, can kind of continue to reinforce and send that message that this is something that people really are hungry for and want, and that's how to effectuate change. So I think it's something that you would have to ask, and then, doctors... it's a complicated system. It's its own bureaucratic system, to say the least. They deal with challenges the same way as we as legal professionals deal with the legal system. So, there's a lot of evolution and growth here.
All right, fantastic. So I know you had mentioned Google, but can you perhaps give us some other sites where, if you know off the top of your head, I know one we posted earlier, where if people wanted to find out more information about collaborative law, that might be some good resources.
Yeah, as you mentioned, we talked about the IACP site earlier. That's a worldwide group, so that's pretty helpful. It's a pretty encompassing site, and that is the collaborativepractice.com site. Locally, in my county and in my jurisdiction, in my state, we have sites that have resources as well, and, happy to send people to those to take a look at those. In my county, it's Collaborative Practice HC, H for Howard and C for County, so collaborativepracticehc.com. And then our statewide group, and there's just so many good, positive things that are happening at the state level in Maryland through the Maryland Collaborative Practice Council. Their website is marylandcollaborativepractice.com. There's a lot of collaborative practice websites in that regard. We actually, in our county and in our state, we've tried to not reinvent the wheel and keep those websites, have some level of consistency with them to make them easier for people to find.
Now, Tom, you touched on this earlier, but I'm very curious because it sounds like, at least in Maryland or in your corner of the world in Baltimore, that the courts are pretty supportive of collaborative law. Would you say that's true across the country or even worldwide? Do you have any thoughts on that? Maybe, I don't know, do you have collaborative law conferences where different practitioners get together and not only learn and get continuing ed, but also just say, hey, what else can we do to help the industry grow?
Yeah, I mean, it can really vary from state to state and county to county in terms of the level of support. There are, particularly when this was beginning, ethical considerations that attorneys, needed to understand, review, and some states are further along, I suppose, in their examination of these things than others. And even within our state, Maryland, which is, an early adopter and pretty far along in terms of its acceptance of it, it still can vary from county to county. In our state, Howard County and Montgomery County, two of the wealthier counties in the country. But they've adopted it, much more so than other areas of the state. So it's something that, again, from a statewide level, speaking as a member of the Maryland Collaborative Practice Council, we're working with practice groups to try to expand it and grow it in our state, and I assume that that's happening in other jurisdictions. So
what would you say to attorneys out there or law students that are in school? Would you say... What advice would you give them if they're maybe thinking about this? I mean, it's my personal view. Again, I'm not an attorney, but, I believe that we as a society or, my opinion is the truth is coming out. And so all the crud and crap and all the bad things that have happened, all that truth is coming to light. And we've entered into a new era, which is more collaborative. It's about being kinder to one another. So, do you have any thoughts of if an attorney's like, this sounds kind of interesting, and maybe I'd want to consider this. Do you have any thoughts, again, for maybe someone's in law school or practicing attorney now? Yeah, I mean, I think, again, we're seeing this more, speaking from a Maryland perspective, that there are courses that are being developed and that are going to occur at law schools. So there are opportunities to be educated about it. It may not be for everyone, whether you're a practitioner or whether it's, from an individual conflict resolution perspective. But to me, the education part of it's important. I'm glad to see it happening in law schools here.
my personal opinion is that probably over time you'll see it happen in other states, similar to mediation. Again, when I was in law school, even in the mid-'90s, early to mid-'90s, we didn't necessarily even know about mediation or weren't trained in that regard. So there are courses that are out there, and for professionals beyond law students, as I'd mentioned earlier, there are trainings that are going on, all over the place these days. And there are opportunities out there to learn about it, to get trained if you want to practice, or to at least, again, from my perspective, I think that it's something that, particularly family law practitioners should at least educate themselves about, because I think you have an ethical obligation to talk to your clients about, their options. And it's one more piece in my tool belt. That's the way I look at it and encourage other people to look at it, because at least you're aware of it and you can choose to practice that way.
All right, now, Tom, there are two questions I like to ask all guests, and even though you're an attorney and a Ravens fan, I'm going to go ahead and ask this. So what advice would you have for someone out there? I mean, you're an attorney. I mean, like you said, you, in some ways, you're not a mental health professional, but just let's be honest, you are a therapist in some regard. So what advice would you have to someone out there that's struggling? Maybe they're going through a divorce, a nasty custody case, or just in a really challenging place. What would you say to them?
Well, I've been there personally, and I've seen people struggle, in my professional life. Going through this type of conflict is not easy. Again, I know that firsthand all too well. And there are grief studies that would compare divorce, with the death of a loved one in terms of emotional pain. It's just a very difficult thing to go through. There's no tiptoeing around that, really. With that being said, what I'm typically tell clients, and again, it's helpful, I think, for me sometimes having gone through it to be empathetic to clients and be a little bit relatable. But what I tell them is that it gets easier over time, and that you'll get through it. Again, I know I know it personally, and I've seen that professionally. Beyond that, I'm always telling my clients that they can only control what they can control, and letting go of what you can't control really is such a weight off of your shoulders. And another Thomism, so to speak, is I always tell clients, I think that by sending clear and consistent messages with a positive tone, that sooner or later there's a breakthrough. Doesn't always happen, but in a higher percentage of cases, that good karma, really does help, I think. You have to mean what you say and do what you claim. And in an emotional situation, there will be ebbs and flows and times where you slip back. But to try to work through that and be consistent in terms of message and positive attitude, I think is really helpful. And the last thing I'd say about that is that, speaking for myself and other clients, many people that I've known, that when you come through the other side, having gone through real challenge like that on a personal level, you come through a stronger person.
I completely believe that, and I've said often on the program that it's always, people think, oh, I can't go through it, it's going to be so bad, but it's worse to hold on to it than not actually go through the process. And when you make it on the other side, you feel so much better. Okay, so your last question is, I'm like all about getting off the couch, so what I mentioned earlier, what one step can people do to reawaken their brilliance?
I've been thinking a lot about this, and, I kind of come back to some of the points that we were kind of maybe touching on just a moment ago. And, what I would say is, challenge yourself and don't be afraid to evolve. Don't live an unfulfilled life, because it's the only life that you have. And if you want to work on your relationship and you want to, stay in a marriage relationship or a relationship otherwise, certainly that's a good thing to do if it's something that is going to make you happy. And is going to make you, more fulfilled. But that can be evolutionary too. I guess the last thing that I would say is that, conflict can be a good thing if it's managed well.
Okay, now tell us, how can we learn more about you and your partner and your practice and all that good stuff?
Right. Well, I'm licensed to practice in Maryland, and my partner, Victor Berger, excellent guy, he's licensed to practice in both New York and Maryland. And our firm is Berger & Burns, and the website is www.berger, B-E-R-G-E-R, Burns, B-U-R-N-S.com, all one word. And that'd be a way to get a bio on myself and Victor and keep up with what we're doing.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Tom. Tom was our first in-house guest tonight. Traveled all the way down for Baltimore to be on the show, and we are excited. And we've got Burger and Burns up there. Burger Burns, I was writing the press release, and Tom's like, you spelled burger like the hamburger. And
a lot of people do that.
I was juicing that week and dreaming of food, so I told him that's why it happened. But Tom's a good guy. Give him 100% endorsement. If you need an attorney in Maryland, please check him out. And again, his partner, if you're looking for an attorney in Maryland and or New York, and an alternative to the and work on that collaborative practice. And I know after all this divorce talk tonight, we've got to talk about love. So here, if you're in the Raleigh area, my next Thrive event is going to be about finding and attracting love. And as I've told people, I listened to the panel last year, and I found the best guy for me ever. So there's hope for me. There's hope for anyone. You can find your love out there. So you can find out more information about that at reawakenyourbrilliance.com. It's February 5th. We got a great super panel on relationships and how to attract that person you love. Also sponsored by Delta Force Technologies. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening. We'll see you here next week. Bye now.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. Our weekly lineup of call-in programs includes Computers 2K Now with Amnon Nissan, Sundays 9 a.m. till noon. Carrie's Psychic Cafe with Carrie Silkowski, Sundays 8 till 9 p.m. Health In with Debbie Bruck, Mondays 11 a.m. till noon. Breaking Free with Marilyn Shannon, Mondays 8 till 9 p.m. Reawaken Your Brilliance with Julie Seibert, Wednesdays, 9 till 10 p.m. And if you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it at nissancommunications.com. Sponsored by ThatVidBlasterGuy.com, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.